Hello everybody, Jake Raby here, Flat 6 Innovations. I want to welcome you back to yet another RenVision technical video. Now this is going to be part 12 in our mini-series, A Focus on Bore Scoring. Again, we're going to go through all the things associated with bore scoring on the Porsche M9X engine from 1997 up to 2008. Cover all those submodels, bring you up to speed with what we've learned since our last videos were shot. We're also going to talk about compression and leak down testing and why those are not good tools in the diagnosis of cylinder bore scoring. So what have we learned since our last videos in this mini-series? Well, we've learned that a lot of the things that we were on the right track with certainly were correct. We've also seen a confirmation of a lot of the things that we had just started to see in high numbers back in the 2019 period. We're continuing to see that. We're also seeing a lot more elective builds, people that just know they're going to end up having a problem at some point. They got a lot of miles on the car. Those cars come in, they don't have any symptoms of bore scoring. We end up finding that the engine was at some stage of bore scoring when it came apart. That has been kind of a constant throughout everything. We also have taken the opportunity to not just shoot this part 12 of the video series, but we've now gone through, reviewed all of our content for the first 11 parts of this mini-series, and we've added to it and we've revised it to make sure that it's up to par for what we see in 2021. Some of that content was as old as 2018. It wasn't misinformation, but in some cases it just was not quite as clear as it should have been. So today we're going to go over a couple of things about diagnosis. We're going to cover leak down and compression testing. And I'm also going to cover something that we continue to see in higher numbers, which is a surface finish problem that is leading to bore scoring within these engines. So first and foremost, a visual inspection via a bore scope device, both through your engine's oil sump and through the spark plug locations, continues to be the only accurate way to conclusively determine if an engine is suffering some stage of bore scoring. I continue to get reports from people who think they have bore scoring, or they're worried about bore scoring, or they're buying a car and they're getting an invasive pre-purchase inspection done, which they certainly should do, and they're finding asymptomatic bore scoring. We continue to see this asymptomatic bore scoring that is very visibly found with the bore scope. And even in some cases where we see symptoms of that dirty tailpipe, the ticking sound that sounds like a lifter, whatever the case may be, that you'll learn about in our other parts of this mini-series where we talk about diagnosing the symptoms of bore scoring, even though those things are apparent, they will have a leak down and a compression test done because the shop that is doing the work believes that these are good tools to use to find bore scoring. That simply isn't the case, and we continue to prove this over and over again, both under our roof here at Flat 6 Innovations, as well as these shops that are performing pre-purchase inspections that report back to us and to the potential purchasers of those vehicles. So these tools, the leak down tester, as well as the compression tester, are very old tools in the quest of gaining knowledge about the mechanical integrity of an engine. These tools used together can help you determine whether you have piston ring problems, cylinder bore problems, just from normal wear, as well as other issues like bore scoring. They also will help you determine where those problems lie. Is it an intake valve? Is it an exhaust valve? Are a pair of valves on these 4-valve engines? Or is the issue something to do with piston ring seal? Okay? So these tools are things that we've used on all sorts of engines. I've used them on everything from Briggs & Strattons to two-stroke race engines to Porsches, old Volkswagens, you name it. And over the years, I've learned a lot about how to interpret what we see from the test. That doesn't just mean where the gauge may lie on a test, but also what we hear during a test, or how the gauge needle responds during that test. How far does it jump up on the first beat? How far on the fourth beat? What's the maximum amount of beats? How does it perform if we squirt some oil in the cylinder? How does it perform if we actually disable the fuel injector on that cylinder and we crank up the engine and perform a running compression test? I've done all of this, and I continue to stand by my statements that these two tools will offer you misinformation in your quest of determining if you have cylinder bore scoring with an M9X engine or not. So first off, for me to kind of make my point about why you don't want to do this test, even if your local independent shop or dealership tells you these are good tools to use, I have to help you understand how these tools work and the dynamics behind cylinder bore scoring to help you understand why they do not give a good representation of diagnosis when it comes to cylinder bore scoring. So first off, we're going to go over the compression tester, okay? So the compression tester basically screws into whatever cylinder spark plug hole that you're trying to test, and it connects with a quick disconnect here, and it gives us a reading, okay? And this reading is in pounds per square inch, PSI. So when I'm doing one of these tests, I'm watching to see how much compression that cylinder is building. Typically the first beat will go up to around 50 pounds, then I'll go do 4 beats after that, record my value, and then I see how many beats of compression it takes to get to a maximum value, as well as what that maximum value is. I then record all of those from all 6 cylinders, and I compare that to my empirical data about what that engine should be based on the atmosphere that I'm testing it in, what my elevation is, what the weather is that day, as well as how many miles are on that engine, what modifications have been done to it, or whatever the case may be. Now, one problem with a compression test is most technicians that do it today in 2021 do not understand the dynamics of how the engine actually operates, despite whatever certification they may have on the wall, or how many cars they race, or what they maintain, or what they've done. They will perform this test with the throttle plate closed. That is the quickest way to end up with deviations in this test that will show a faults issue, because it's going to take into consideration the design of the intake manifolds, which is not perfect, and it may give some cylinders more chamber filling than others. So the first thing that I do when somebody sends me a submission ticket through flat6innovations.com sharing compression data with me about their bore scoring, the first thing I do is shake my head, because this is virtually worthless, okay? The second thing that I do is I look at it and I can tell by the data they've collected that the test was done with the throttle plate closed. I then ask that person, ask your technician if they opened the throttle plate and held it open during this test. 9 times out of 10, it was not done. At that point in time, every bit of that data is out the window, because it's taking into consideration the design of the intake manifold, and it's going to give you false readings. So you must perform all compression tests with the throttle plate locked in the wide open position. Of course, to do that, you've got to ensure the engine's not going to try to run. You got to pull the fuel pump / DME relay. You have to mechanically go in and lock the throttle open and make sure nothing gets sucked into the engine while you're doing this. It takes some common sense. It takes some extra time. But if you don't do that, you're not going to get good compression data. You're going to think you have a problem that you really don't have. The other thing about the compression test is, in the old days, when we perform compression tests, before the days of variable valve timing and all these other modern things, if we're talking about an old engine with a carburetor and a set of points that was very simple, if we would do a compression test and we wanted to see some deviations with what that compression test would do if we shot some oil in the cylinder, we would pull the compression tester out after we got our first round of data. We would shoot some oil into the cylinder, a couple of squirts from an old mechanical oil delivery pump, if you will, or some WD-40 or whatever. We'd shoot some oil in the cylinder. We would perform the test again. If the test values went up, we knew that we had a piston or cylinder issue, and we would record that data so we could compare it to what we learned when we did the next test using the leak down tester. Okay, none of these things these testers are not something that is going to solve a problem for you. They're only as good as a person who is using them. And in today's world, more technicians learn about onboard diagnostics and diagnosing things with a computer than they do mechanical intervention. That's the reason why we see so many false tests and so many tests that just give us basic misinformation and help people jump down the wrong rabbit hole. So when we're specifically addressing the topic of cylinder bore scoring and diagnosis using these two tools, the first thing we have to understand is the way the cylinder, piston, and piston rings work. So those three things are part of a soup that has ingredients, and one of the big ingredients into the ring seal is the piston ring. That piston ring and the oil around the piston ring is what seals off the cylinder. And when we squirt more oil into the cylinder and we perform the dry compression test as well as we shoot some oil in the cylinder and we watch how that behaves, we always see a higher reading on the compression tester, i.e. a better reading on the compression tester with oil introduced into the cylinder if we have a cylinder sealing issue, be it scoring, bad rings, oval cylinders, scored cylinders, whatever the case may be. We see an increase in compression on the gauge with every portion of our test once you introduce the oil. So now I have a piston here from a Porsche M9X engine. So what I want to try to get across to you is the reason why, if we have a scored bore, that scored bore could potentially and usually will perform better under a compression test than a bore that is not scored. So here, these ring grooves are where your piston rings would reside. You have an oil control ring, you have a second compression ring, which is greatly responsible for oil consumption with these engines, and you have a top ring. All three of these rings will test better, not perform better, but they will test better if some oil can pass by them. When, in the case of the cylinder bore scoring, oil is able to pass by those piston rings, and therefore it will do the exact same thing as my old school test did when I shot oil into the cylinder. You end up with excess oil in that cylinder, therefore that cylinder on the compression tester gauge will perform better under the test. This will give you a false indication that the cylinder that is actually bad and has wear, has oil going around the cylinder, piston rings, all that sort of thing, is a better cylinder. In that case, sometimes we see bores that are scored performing better on the compression tester than the cylinders around them that may not be injured. So for the same reason that this engine performs better under testing with this compression tester comes the fact of why the engine will continue to run okay even though it has cylinder bore scoring. This is a characteristic that we've even seen leads to these engines making more power than an engine that does not have cylinder bore scoring. I've conclusively determined that on at least 15 different occasions on our chassis dynamometer. We've had engines that performed better with bore scoring than they did if they didn't have scored bores. The reason why this is because the engine oil has a very low octane rating. It gets up by the piston rings, gets in the combustion chamber, and it will actually create a scenario where the engine can make more power. It can also lead to pre-detonation, which we see happen with some of this stuff, so it's not a good thing. But it's one of those situations where the engine can continue to run fine, even sometimes with stage 4 bore scoring, where you've got a lot of piston clacking, you've got a lot of this piston slap, as people call it. It's that confusingly similar lifter sound. The engine continues to run okay, or run fine. If you're the owner of one of those cars, the things that are happening with this engine are not going to make sense to you. You should think that with an engine that has this level of damage done to it, that requires a full disassembly of said engine and a very expensive reconstruction, that engine should not perform at all. Or if it performs, it should smoke like crazy. It should do all of these things that it doesn't do. One reason it doesn't smoke very much is because the catalytic converters are great filters. They're an activated filter. They're a catalyst. They don't just burn those emissions, they can actually help to burn that exhaust away that would normally be filled with a James Bond smoke screen. If you have bore scoring, you may have a James Bond smoke screen. If you do, perhaps your catalytic converters or your secondary air is not performing correctly. Sometimes that is because you've had bore scoring so long that the bore scoring and the oil consumption helps to effectively take out the efficiency of your catalytic converters. So it's not uncommon, actually it's very common, if we have a car come to us that's had extensive bore scoring, it will need catalytic converters very soon after our reconstruction procedure is carried out, or sometimes before we even release the vehicle back to the owner. So before we go on and talk about the leak down tester, I just want to finish up with the compression tester and basically define it is what we use for a static test or even a dynamic test while the engine is running to see the behavior of the needle and see how much compression a given cylinder is able to make. Compression is the lifeblood of combustion. We have to keep the compression within the combustion chamber, between the piston rings and the valves, everything sealed off so we get full and complete combustion for the air and fuel mixture. Based on my direct experience performing invasive evaluations of engines that have known bore scoring and assumed bore scoring, my direct experience will tell me if you pay a shop or you take your own time to do a compression test, especially just on the starter statically, it is going to be a complete and total waste of your time, money, and effort to do so. If you believe you have cylinder bore scoring, you're going to follow the things that we define in part 4 of our mini-series, a focus on bore scoring, to help you conclusively determine it. So with that being said, now we're going to go on over and talk about our leak down tester. So the leak down tester, we're able to use shop air, which comes in here. We set the gauge to 100 psi. With shop air, we are able to adjust it here, and that will give us a percentage of leak down. So X amount of air is going in. It's the job of this total seal leak down checker to tell us how much of that air is staying in the confines of the cylinder. So with this test, it helps us to determine if we have a problem with intake valves, exhaust valves, or a problem with cylinder seal. Now, if you have a really worn engine, you can have some leakage by the valves, you can have some leakage by the piston rings and the cylinder, and those things can work together to give you a bad reading, or a reading that sometimes is assumed to be good, but it's really bad because this is not really a good test for a bore scored engine. So at the end of the day, when you do this test, you're bringing in that 100 psi of shop air, and I pull off the air filter box and I listen because I want to hear how much air that is escaping. Let's say we've got 10% of leak down, okay? I want to see how much of that is coming from the intake valves. So we listen for that, a small hiss or a lot of air. If we hear a lot of air, it's probably responsible for a good portion, if not all, of the leak down that's showing up on the gauge at 10%. I also do the same thing to the exhaust. I listen to the exhaust. Do I hear any air there? I pull off the oil cap, which is directly going into the crankcase, and I see what I am able to hear there. I take my stethoscope and pull off the probe on the end of it that has a long tube, and I stick that up in the exhaust, or I stick it up in the intake, or I stick it down inside the oil filler tube. I want to see where the air is leaking from, okay? Because this air is being introduced into the spark plug hole. That helps me tell exactly where the leak down is coming from. Now, by the same token that the compression tester will give us false results for a bore scored engine, so will this leak down tester. You might ask why. It's just going to leak down. At the end of the day, the oil that's able to make it by that scored bore is going to act as a seal and will actually heal up the scored portions of the bore, effectively sealing that off so it will test better than it performs. So you can have an engine that passes a leak down test with flying colors. It may have 1 or 2% or no percentage of leak down. and still pass this test perfectly, but has very severe bore scoring. These things defy conventional wisdom. All of you who have worked on other engines and haven't seen what we've seen and haven't seen people make misdiagnosis using these two very well-known tools that have been used for the last 100 years, basically, to diagnose engines and health of an engine, this is not going to make any sense to you. And guess what? In the beginning, it didn't make any sense to me either. So with cylinder bore scoring, at the end of the day, the point I'm trying to make is the injury that is bore scoring is also responsible for making your cylinders test better using these very conventional tools of compression and leak down tester. So I highly discourage the use of either of these to determine if you have bore scoring. You've got to use the bore scope, you've got to go in from the engine oil sump, you've got to come in from the spark plug hole, you have to move your piston up and down in the bore from top dead center to bottom dead center, look at every cylinder conclusively to see if you have bore scoring. There is no other way to determine this because, like I've said many times here, these two tests will lead you to believe that you do not have a problem and even have a cylinder that is better, even though it is the cylinder that is the worst. I've conclusively proven this. I want to keep you from making the mistake so many people do when they spend $800 to $1,000 to have a shop perform these tests that have no merit whatsoever in the diagnostic process related to cylinder bore scoring. So in today's test, using this particular block that has bore scoring on cylinders 5 and cylinder 6, which are here and here, cylinder 4 has no bore scoring. Cylinder 4 looks fine. We see this a lot of times. Some engines will have just one bore that's very scored, or just two that are very scored, or all 6 are scored. So this one has a perfect cylinder in number 4. Wear is very good on it. Cylinders 5 and 6 are extremely scored. And we're just going to share some raw data that we're collecting from our SJ210 profilometer. Now this tells us the surface finish of these particular cylinders tested in micro inches. Basically, a millionth of an inch is the accuracy level of this particular surface tester. We're going to see a roughness average, we're going to see an RK average, we're going to see an RPK and an RVK. The RVK is the depth of the valleys in the cylinder finish. The RPK is the height of the peaks, okay? So it's almost like you're looking at a mountain, okay? All the peaks going down are your RVK, all the peaks coming up are your RPK, okay? V is valley, P is peak, and of course the RK is the kind of the difference between those two as an average. So while we're not going to go over this content today as far as what it actually means, we're going to collect this from cylinder 4, cylinder 5, and cylinder 6. And where we're going to collect this is outside of the piston ring and piston travel. I am measuring these bores in an area that has never seen any wear. It's never seen any load. It has not had a piston or a piston ring traveling over it. So again, I'm going to say that. It has not had a piston or a piston ring traveling over it. It is outside of ring and piston travel. So what we're actually going to be doing is looking at the surface finish that these cylinders had the day they were installed and the block was finished at the factory. They have not seen any wear or any load. So the panel we've assembled to help us go over this content with you is going to consist of myself, Charles Navarro of LN Engineering, Lake Speed Jr. of Total Seal Piston Rings, and a couple of special guests from outside the Porsche engine industry to help us really put a cap on what they believe these values mean. Now, I know what they mean. Those of you who understand things with profilometers and surface testing are going to know what they mean. You'll be able to look at these values and see. But basically, we're going to compare virgin surface finish data from a cylinder that has not had any scoring to that of 2 cylinders that have had extensive scoring, leading to this engine coming to Flat 6 Innovations for a reconstruction. So here I've got the SJ210 profilometer installed into place, and I've cleaned this cylinder lightly to make sure there's no dirt or any kind of debris on the surface. And we're going to perform a test with the SJ210 outside of the piston ring travel, which you see here, at an area that the piston has never traveled. We're going to go ahead and perform that test now. And in the very beginning here, you will see a bit of a trace at the beginning of this test. I want you to pay attention to this surface finish plot. I want you to look at the consistency of it as it travels across the range of measurement. Again, no piston or ring has traveled in this area. Now, once it's finished the evaluation, it's going to then put things into some averages and some values that I will then share with you. Okay, so here's our values from our known good cylinder number 4. So our roughness average, our peak, our valley, and the average between the peaks and the valleys. So pay attention to those values. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and move the profilometer to cylinder number 5. And I'm putting it in the exact same location as we had in cylinder 4. Okay, it's there. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start a new test. And again, pay close attention to this waveform as the surface finish profilometer here travels over the unfinished portion of the cylinder, or at least non-scored portion of the cylinder. Those of you paying attention have already seen a difference. And look at these values. Okay, now I'm going to move to cylinder number 6, which is the most scored of all of the bores in this block. I'm going to keep it in this same area where there's been no travel. So number 5 was not quite as scored as number 6. That's going to come into play as our panel starts talking about things. Start another test. Again, pay attention to the waveform. And there's our values on that one. So now we're going to throw up on the screen for you some comparative photos of cylinders 4, 5, and 6, both from the waveform as well as the actual values we were able to collect from the SJ210. So our evaluation of the surface finish of these cylinders is not over, because we've now been able to surface finish test the area where there has been no ring or piston travel. And now we're going to an area in the center of the bore that has seen piston and ring travel. Now, I've had to find a special spot in each one of these cylinders, which is basically at the 3 and 9 o'clock type of position, where no scoring is able to be noted, okay? Because if we were to go over the scored area, of course, it's going to look like the surface of the moon. It's not going to tell us anything. So the area I'm going to go over is the same in each bore, and that area is both clean and is not scored. But it does have normal wear on it from the piston rings that have been traveling up and down that bore for that period of time. So we're starting on cylinder 4 again, and we're just going to perform our test, exact same as before. We're right in the middle of the bore, so you're already noticing some differences here, okay, if you're paying attention. And again, we're not going to go over what these differences mean right now. I'm just showing you guys some data. Our panel is going to go over this. We kind of all are on the same page about what we're seeing with this. These tests are also being done at LN Engineering with every block they see, just like what we're seeing here. Okay, now look at your differences. This is just normal wear from the area that the rings and pistons have been traveling over. This engine had 36,000 miles on it. Okay, now I'm going to move the unit to the next cylinder. We're going to go down to cylinder number 5, exact same location. Okay, and we're going to perform the test. Keep in mind, this was a bore that had bore scoring. It wasn't as bad as cylinder 6, but it does have significant bore scoring. And that bore scoring is located on the top side of the bore. We are measuring 90 degrees away from that scored area. Okay, here's our values. Okay, now I'm going to go to cylinder 6, which is undeniably the most scored of any bore in this block. Again, I'm going right back to the same location to get my surface test, surface finish evaluation done here. We're still 90 degrees away from the biggest wear patch in that cylinder. And we're going to perform the test. Now pay close attention to what you're seeing here. Look at what you just saw there. And here are our values on cylinder 6. So those of you who have been paying attention have been able to see some common denominators here between scored cylinders and non-scored cylinders, both in and outside of piston ring and piston travel. So I just want to end this particular RenVision technical video by letting everybody know that we're going to get our panel together. We're going to review all this data. A focus on bore scoring part number 13 will result from our panel getting together live and going over this data and helping each of you understand what you're seeing here. This is not just one case. I've got 4 more blocks sitting here that will all test very similarly to this, that have the same type of scoring going on. They range between 30,000 and 120,000 miles. And this is what we've seen consistently with a lot of the engines that come to us that have very light bore scoring or very heavy bore scoring. And we constantly see the surface finish values are dramatically impacted by the cylinders that have scoring even outside of the piston ring travel. So now, just for a crazy comparative, I've actually put the profilometer right over the worst part of cylinder 6's scored bore area. We want to see just exactly what kind of roughness average and RVK and RPK and RK we're going to end up with on a scored surface. And that is pretty insane. Gives you an idea of exactly just how rough really is. So as we close out Focus on Bore Scoring Part 12, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. I want to invite you to subscribe to the newsletters at Flat 6 Innovations. Also like the Flat 6 Innovations Facebook page, as well as the RenVision Facebook page and the Knowledge Group Facebook page. We share a lot of information there. Now the reason you want to do that is because you want to be alerted when we do a live broadcast with our panel going over the data that we collected today as we go through and evaluate that with each one of our different panels' direct experience from their perspective. Again, we're going to have Charles Navarro of Ellen Engineering there, who manufactures Nicky cylinders and does that Nicosil process, who sees more of these blocks than anybody in North America. We're going to have Lake Speed Jr. there of Total Seal Piston Rings. He's our exclusive piston ring supplier here at Flat 6 Innovations. He's also been a critical part of the quest of understanding these failures, as well as developing new technologies along with us, like Sumabore cylinder technologies, as well as further perfection of the Nicosil process. And then we're going to have a couple of other critical members on that panel as well, one of which is nothing more than a metrologist. All he does is come in and check out surface finishes of all kinds of components. And then I'm going to try to ask a friend of mine to come in who hones a tremendous amount of engine blocks, not just Porsche stuff. He does Top Fuel dragsters, he does Indy cars, he does all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to invite him to be a member of the panel as well, so he can shed some light about what he's seen from non-competition and competition engines, because he hones about 300 different blocks per year. So thank you for joining us here on RenVision. Invite you to join us for Part 13 in the Focus on Bore Scoring series. That one will be live, and we're also going to record it for future viewing.